A sickening smell of rot clung to the bed of England's boy king. At just 15, Edward VI lay propped upright, lungs tearing themselves apart, forcing up thick yellow-green slime streaked with black and pink, the color of blood, until his pillow was soaked and his doctors quietly admitted they could no longer save him. What had begun as a simple fever and cough only months earlier had become a nightmare inside his chest, to great, putrefied ulcers eating through his lungs. While his legs swelled, his skin broke out in ulcers, and his hair and nails fell away as infection and organ failure spread through his body. This is not legend or exaggeration. This is the documented death of Edward VI, the only legitimate son of Henry VIII, likely destroyed by a brutal lung infection, probably tuberculosis, that turned a living prince into his own autopsy report. If you want more true dark history they never taught you in school, built only from real sources and real bodies, subscribe now and stay to the end of this story. He came into the world in a blood-stained bed that killed his mother. In October 1537, in the deep corridors of Hampton Court, Jane Seymour screamed through a brutal labor while the court waited for one sound: a living boy. Hours later, a tiny cry saved a dynasty and began the short, cursed life of Edward Tudor, the child who would die with his lungs rotting in his chest. Henry VIII finally had his miracle heir. The bells rang, guns fired, London roared with celebration. 12 days later, the woman who had given England its future king was dead, her body overwhelmed by the same kind of infection that would one day consume her son from the inside. From the start, Edward's life was treated like a holy relic. Servants scrubbed his chambers, filtered his air, inspected everyone who came near him. No speck of dirt, no hint of sickness was allowed to touch the boy who carried the whole kingdom on his narrow shoulders, while other Tudor children ran through draughty halls and breathed in the filth of London streets. Edward was sealed away in polished rooms that glittered with wax and glass, watched day and night. Every bite of food he ate was checked. Every goblet was tasted first by another mouth. His body was a fortress because England could not afford to lose him. But a fortress can also become a prison. As he grew, Edward learned quickly Latin phrases, sharp theology, the language of power, but his world was strangely small, bounded by books, tutors, and the constant fear of illness. He saw very little blood, yet his entire existence was about preventing it. The man who had torn the church in half to get a son now hovered over a boy who coughed in the night, and might, with one bad fever, drag the Tudor name into the grave with him. By the time he was 9, the crown was pressed onto a child's head that still barely reached a grown man's chest. Behind the golden orb and scepter, behind the cheers and the painted celebrations, everyone in that hall knew the truth. If this boy failed to live, England would plunge back into chaos. A single young body now carried the weight of centuries, and every small weakness in that body, every chill, every shiver, every tightening in his chest was a threat not just to him, but to every soul in the kingdom. They raised him to think, not to play. While most children learned the shapes of clouds and the sound of mud under their boots, Edward learned Latin verbs and the weight of eternity. From the age when other boys were still tripping over their own feet, he was drilled by scholars, with ink-stained fingers and cold eyes, men who spoke to him not as a child, but as the future will of God on earth. Scripture, languages, philosophy, the arguments of dead theologians, these were poured into him day after day, until his mind sharpened like a blade his small body could barely carry. He listened, he absorbed, and quietly, something fierce grew behind his pale face. Edward did not dream of chasing dogs in the courtyard. He imagined smashing idols, purging heresy, building a kingdom so pure that even his ancestors would not recognize it. While candles burned down around him, he read of judgment and wrath, of kings chosen and kings cast down. The men who tutored him thought they were shaping a model prince. What they were really building was a boy who believed that God spoke more clearly through books than through human screams. Yet his life was not only parchment and prayer. His father insisted on hardening the royal shell. Edward was pushed onto horses taller than he was, handed weapons heavier than his arms, made to ride, fence, and perform before watchful, nervous faces. Every slip, every stumble, every bruise sent a quiet shiver through the room. The future of England could not fall, could not break, could not so much as limp. So he learned to hide pain, to straighten his back even when it ached, to treat discomfort as weakness that must be ground out of his flesh around him. Courtiers bowed low and smiled too widely. They praised his towardness, his piety, his quick tongue, each compliment a chain tightening around his throat. He began keeping his own little journal, noting events with a chilling simplicity. Battles, executions, policies, each one reduced to a few calm lines. It was as if he were training himself to see human life the way his tutors saw doctrine, as something to be arranged, corrected, sacrificed. From the nursery to the schoolroom, one message was hammered into him. England rests on you, your soul, your body, your lungs. Every breath you take is a piece of the realm continuing to exist. It is no wonder, then, that when his chest finally started to fail, when each cough shook his narrow frame, the terror in the palace ran deeper than fear of death. They had not just groomed a king. They had grafted a country onto the organs of a single boy, organs that, all too soon, would begin to rot. On paper, he was king. In reality, he was a mask other men wore to rule. When Henry VIII's body was barely cold, powerful relatives and counselors closed in around the 9-year-old boy and quietly decided who would move his hand, who would guide his pen, who would speak through his thin lips. They gave his uncle, Edward Seymour, a grand new title, Lord Protector, and let him stand in front of the child like a human shield. To the crowds, it looked like a loyal guardian. Inside the palaces, everyone knew the truth. While the boy signed, the uncle fed the words. Somerset moved fast. Under Edward's innocent name, chantries were stripped, images hacked from church walls, painted saints smashed into chalk dust. Altars came down, gold and stone, that had watched over the dead for generations were torn out in the name of a purer faith and a richer crown. Villages woke to bare churches that felt colder even in summer, their color ripped away, their familiar rituals turned into something harsher and strange. Yet when people muttered about blasphemy, they did not curse Somerset. They whispered that the young king wanted it. The boy became a cloak for other men's ambition. From the royal schoolroom, Edward watched all this through pages and reports. His tutors praised the godly reforms done in his name. They read him letters about smashed images, about new English services, about priests dragged into line. Each success was presented as his triumph. Each act of destruction is his bravery. Imagine what that does to a mind already steeped in judgment and purity. Every broken statue, every empty shrine, every robbed foundation was one more stone laid in the monument of his supposed righteousness. But masks are dangerous things. They fuse to the skin. As Somerset tightened his grip, ruling by proclamation and drowning England in costly wars and unrest, enemies gathered in dark corners. Another man, John Dudley, circled like a patient wolf, watching the Protector overreach. He learned from Somerset's mistakes, where the first uncle ruled openly in the boy's name. The next strong man would make it seem as though the king himself had grown teeth. All the while, Edward's body remained the weakest link in the chain. Councillors plotted, armies moved, churches were gutted, and rebellions flared, all resting on the assumption that this one teenager would survive long enough to make their changes permanent. Every decree they pushed through his trembling signature bound the fate of England tighter to his bones. They treated his chest as if it were a stone foundation, not soft, vulnerable tissue that could, with the wrong infection, begin to liquefy. And somewhere deep inside the carefully protected ribcage, something was already waiting, quiet, patient, and deadly, that would one day bring the entire structure crashing down. By the time Edward could read his own name in state papers, the world beyond his guarded windows was starting to rot, not in silent, hidden ways like the disease that would one day burrow into his chest, but openly, in the streets, in the fields, in the faces of the people who were supposed to call him savior. Prices crept upward like a slow fever. Coins felt lighter in the hand. Their silver thinned and spoiled. Bread cost more. Meat disappeared from tables that had once seen it at least on Sundays. For families already living on the edge, every small rise in cost felt like a hand closing around their throats. The sheep felt it too. Across the countryside, fields that had fed people for generations were fenced and hedged, turned from shared land into private pastures. Enclosure, the polite word for eviction, spread like a rash over the map. Where villagers had once grazed a cow or gathered firewood, they now found barriers, ditches, and men ready to drive them off. In Norfolk, in Devon, in Cornwall, anger boiled under the surface, as if the soil itself resented being rearranged. Hungry men and women looked up at the distant royal child and were told, "This is all for the good of the realm. This is reform." The pressure finally broke in 1549. Crowds that had endured too much for too long snapped. In the West Country, worshippers who still clung to Latin prayers rose when a new English prayer book was forced into their churches. They did not just argue, they armed themselves. In Norfolk, ordinary people ripped up the hedges of rich landowners, then followed a man named Robert Kett to camp above Norwich, as if the hill itself were a judgment seat. These were not carefully plotted revolutions. They were eruptions raw, messy, desperate. But when the government wrote about them, it gave them a single, chilling label: rebellion, and whose name was on the orders that crushed those uprisings. Edwards, the boy, did not lead the armies or shout commands over the clash of steel. Yet it was under his authority that cannon tore through crowds, that thousands in the West were slaughtered in the name of obedience, that men from Kett's camp swung from gibbets as examples to anyone who might dare question the new order, while troops hacked their way through. Villagers who simply wanted the old faith or their old fields. The royal signature at the bottom of the death warrants belonged to a teenager, whose greatest personal crime so far was coughing at the wrong time in front of his physicians. From palaces thick with incense and polished stone, it might have seemed that the king's body was safe, that all the danger was out there in the mobs, the famines, the mutterings against change. In reality, the terror ran in both directions. The poor watched a remote, unseen boy turn their world upside down. The ruling elite watched that same fragile frame and knew that if anything happened to it, if his lungs seized, if an infection took hold, if his heart gave out, all their bloodshed, all their tearing down and building up, could be swept away overnight. England, by Edward's mid-teens, was a kingdom balanced on an inflamed, overburdened chest, a country that had already started to convulse long before its young king did. The sickness that would one day hollow out Edward's lungs did not arrive as a monster. It slipped in disguise as something every Tudor child feared, but many survived. In the spring of 1552, the boy who had been wrapped in silk and guarded from every chill finally met the old enemies that prowled outside his polished chambers: measles and smallpox. The rash came first, a crawling heat over his skin, dots blooming like infected stars across his body. Fever gripped him, burning through the thin barrier that had always stood between him and the common world's filth. For the first time, the air of England lay sweating and shaking with the same diseases that had already buried countless nameless children. Panicked physicians fluttered around his bed, armed with the best horrors Tudor medicine could offer. They opened veins to balance his blood, weakening him further. They dosed him with bitter draughts, strange brews meant to drive out corruption, but often as poisonous as the sickness itself. Servants stripped and redressed his bed, wiping away the sour stink of fevered skin. Outside the chamber, courtiers held their breath and calculated futures. If this boy slipped away, years of ruthless reform, every smashed altar and stolen chalice, could be rolled back in an instant. For several days, the palace felt like a besieged city. News trickled through corridors, his pulse racing, then fading, his eyes bright, then dull. Prayers were ordered, special services were sung. The same God invoked to justify tearing down the old faith was now begged to spare the frail body that had authorized it. And then, just as suddenly as the worst began, the crisis seemed to ebb. The rash faded. The fevers broke. The boy sat up, ate, even joked. In his own neat hand, he recorded that he had fallen sick and shaken it off, as if he'd simply shrugged away the touch of death. To those watching, it looked like a clean escape. A royal brush with danger survived. Celebrations resumed. Plans continued. The lesson they took was simple. Edward had endured the trial and emerged hardened, proof that heaven still favored the new order. But something unseen had changed. Modern medicine would later learn that measles can strip the body's defenses, wiping its memory of old enemies, leaving a hollowed-out immune system where a strong one once stood. Edward did not know that. His doctors did not know that. Yet the effect was the same. The shield that had guarded his organs from quiet, lurking infections was now cracked. When the court moved on and the prayers of thanksgiving faded, no one could see what had been left behind by that spring illness, how it had scoured his inner defenses, how it had opened the door for something far more patient and devastating. Somewhere in the dark spaces of his chest, and tissues that had survived the first assault, a slower killer now had its opportunity. The boy had recovered, but the price of that recovery was that, from this point on, every breath he took was just a little less protected than the last. Winter came early for Edward VI, and it settled in his chest. It began like 100 harmless colds before it, a tightness behind the ribs, a tickle in the throat, an evening shiver that servants blamed on a draft in the corridor. He coughed once, twice, pressing a sleeve to his mouth so the sound wouldn't echo in the paneled room. No one panicked. Boys caught chills. Boys recovered. And for a few days, that seemed true. He took broths, rested, let his lessons slide. Courtiers told each other he would be back on his feet in no time. But the cough did not leave. It changed. It burrowed deeper, became heavier, more violent, pulling at something raw inside him. Each new fit shook his thin frame, dragging the air out of him in ragged bursts that left him dizzy. The sound turned from a dry rasp into something wetter, thicker, as though his lungs were starting to fill with something that did not belong there. At night, those closest to his chamber could hear it through the doors, long stretches of silence, broken by sudden, brutal spasms that seemed to tear at his insides. Fever slid back over him like a second skin. His body grew hot enough that the linen at his throat clung damp to his pulse. He complained of a weight over his chest, as if someone had set a stone there while he slept. Climbing a short flight of stairs left him breathless. Walking into gardens once as simple, controlled display of royal vigor began to look like a punishment. He would pause, swallow, wait for the dizziness to pass while watchful eyes marked every faltering step. Physicians circled, rattled and unsure. To them, it was still a feverish cold, an inconvenience that would bow to. Leeches and rest. They recommended that he stay within his privy chambers, away from drafts and strangers. The walls closing. The boy who had always been protected from the outside world was now trapped from within, confined not by protocol, but by his own failing breath. The more they shut doors around him, the more the rumors seeped through the cracks, whispers of weakness, of God's displeasure, of a king whose body was already breaking. Eager not to show fear, Edward forced himself to behave as though nothing irreparable was happening. He attended to business when he could, signed where they pointed, even appeared in public on days when the fever briefly loosened its grip. On those rare outings, powdered and stiff in rich fabrics, he looked almost like the old image of himself. But if you watched closely, you could see it, the slight hitch before he inhaled, the way a hand would drift to his ribs as though to steady something unstable inside, the gray flicker of exhaustion around his mouth. What no one realized then was that this was not a simple winter illness. That would pass with the season. Each fit of coughing was the sound of damage being carved, slowly, into his lungs. Each night of labored breathing fed a process that had already begun. The quiet transformation of a feverish cold into the long, Murderous siege that would end with Edward gasping in his own bed, drowning not in water, but in the corruption. His body could no longer fight. By early 1553, the cough had learned his rhythm. It waited for him. It knew when he laid down, when he tried to speak, when he dared to feel normal for a moment. At first, the attacks came in short bursts, a few harsh barks that tore at his throat and left a sour taste on his tongue. Servants brought sweet lozenges and warm wine, the same harmless comforts that soothed minor colds. They didn't work. The fits grew longer, deeper, more violent, as if invisible hands were squeezing his lungs from the inside, wringing something foul out of them drop by drop. One night, he pressed a cloth to his mouth and felt it come away damp, not just with saliva, but with something thicker, heavier. When he looked, there was a streak of color that did not belong in a healthy body, yellowish, darkened, touched with a faint stain like old bruises. He said nothing. The next night, it happened again. Soon, every coughing spell ended with him spitting into bowls and handkerchiefs, watching strange shades appear, greenish, almost black, then a pale pink that made his stomach twist. It was as if his chest had become a pit, and each breath dredged up filth from the bottom. The smell changed the room. His bedchamber had once reeked of beeswax, incense, and expensive herbs. Now an underlying odor crept in, sour, metallic, faintly rotten. Servants scrubbed the floors, burned strong perfumes, opened windows when they dared. But the stench clung to the linens and the cushions where his head rested. It seeped into the wood, into the fabric, into the very air. Anyone who stepped inside for the first time could sense it, not just sickness, but decay in progress. Doctors argued over him in hushed Latin, grasping for explanations that made sense in a world of humors and bad airs. Some blamed corrupted phlegm sinking into the lungs. Others muttered about a tumor festering out of sight, a swelling deep in the chest that no knife could reach. They ordered more bleeding, more purges, more foul-tasting concoctions designed to draw poison from within. Each remedy left him weaker. The cough, insulted by their efforts, only tightened its hold. Edward tried to cling to his routine. He heard counsel business from his bed, signed papers with a hand that trembled just enough to betray the effort, forced himself to appear composed in front of those who knelt beside the mattress. He knew, now, that every man in the room was measuring him, not just his decisions, but his breathing. How long could this body hold? How many more laws could they push through before the chest beneath the blankets simply stopped rising? Outside, the world heard only fragments, that the king was unwell, that he was improving, that he was taking the air on better days. No one beyond the inner circle understood what those phrases really meant. Taking the air meant being carried, wrapped in layers, for a brief glimpse of sky before the exhaustion forced him back to bed. Improving meant that the fever dipped just enough for him to speak in full sentences. Between attacks, somewhere between those carefully worded updates and the reality of his heaving lungs, a line was crossed. This was no longer a passing winter sickness, no longer a residual weakness from childhood infections. The thing inside his chest had settled in, rooted itself, and begun to eat. With every bout of coughing, Edward was not simply struggling for breath. He was giving up pieces of himself, one foul-colored mouthful at a time. By the time the cough had carved its place inside him, another slow horror was taking shape around Edward. People began planning for a future where he did not exist. The boy was still alive, still struggling for breath in his shadowed chamber. But beyond those walls, men were already sketching England without him, as if his body were just an hourglass running out of sand. Every new spasm from his lungs was mirrored by fresh lines of ink on secret drafts lines that decided who would sit where he lay, whose fate would rule when his chest finally fell still. They did not dare say it openly. When the king is dead. Instead, they spoke in careful phrases. Should the worst happen, if God calls him home, behind those polite words was raw calculation. The law said that after Edward, the crown should pass to his half-sister Mary, Catholic, relentless. a living threat to everything that had been torn down in his name. For the men who had profited from smashed monasteries and bleeding rebels, that future looked like Judgment Day. So, while the king coughed himself hoarse, they put a quill in his hand and began to guide it once more. This time, the document they pressed on him was not another reform, not a new prayer book, but a weapon aimed at his own blood. It was a device, a careful plan to leap over Mary and Elizabeth and land the crown on the head of Lady Jane Grey, young fiercely Protestant girl linked by blood and by marriage to the same family, now steering Edward as fating will. They told him it was his duty. They told him it was God's wish. They told him that, even from a sickbed, he could save England as soul by choosing a successor who would not undo his godly changes. Imagine the scene. A teenager propped up by pillows, fingers thin and stiff, forcing his hand across parchment while his chest heaves beneath the covers. Each stroke drains him, but each word tightens the rope around Maria's claim and binds the country to a path that will only be tested once his lungs finally give out. Outside the room, messengers race, allies are sounded out, soldiers discreetly positioned. Inside, the person on whose name all this rests can barely finish a sentence without pausing for air. The more the plot took shape, the more the king's body betrayed the urgency behind it. There were days when his coffee is just enough for false hope to bloom. Maybe he would rally. Maybe he would live to see this plan enforced by his own eyes. Then the night would come, and with it a new storm in his chest. Fresh waves of foul-colored sputum, another layer of exhaustion grinding him down. Hope rose and fell with his temperature. The ink on the page, however, did not fade. It dried, permanent, a contract written as much with his failing breath as with black pigment. By late spring, everyone close to the truth understood the terrible symmetry at work. As the disease slowly strangled the last Tudor boy king, he was helping strangle the old line of succession with him. His body was a battlefield, but so was the paper under his hand. In trying to keep his religious world alive beyond his own lifespan, Edward allowed himself to be used one last time as a dying instrument to reshape the future. Every signature, every seal added while he struggled to stay conscious pushed England closer to the chaos that would erupt the moment his lungs finally stopped moving. By early summer, Edward's entire body had become a map of what was happening inside his chest. It started with a heaviness in his limbs that no amount of rest could shift. When servants helped him sit up, his legs felt strange, as if they belonged to someone else, thick, tight, slow to respond. Under the blankets, the skin of his calves and ankles began to swell, pressing against the fabric until even the lightest touch left a deep, shrinking imprint. Fluid that should have been moving cleanly through his veins was now pulling, trapped, a quiet sign that organs far inside him were starting to fail. His skin told its own story. What had once been a pale, smooth mask fit for painted portraits developed a gray, waxy cast. Patches of redness appeared, then broke, turning into raw, weeping sores that refused to heal. Along his back and sides, where bone pressed against mattress, new lesions opened like little mouths, leaking and crusting over, only to split again when he was shifted. The constant fever baked him from within, but his hands and feet often felt unnaturally cold, as if the heat in his core no longer reached the edges of him. Every movement hurt. Turning from one side to the other dragged torn skin across stained sheets. Sitting upright crushed his ribs against lungs that already fought for space. Even the weight of blankets could feel unbearable on the swollen flesh beneath. His hair, once carefully groomed to present a neat royal image, began to thin and come away in the comb. Nails loosened, darkened, lifted from their beds. Bit by bit, the outer shell that had once convinced people he was tough enough to carry a kingdom started to disintegrate, matching the unseen destruction in the organs beneath. Sleep no longer brought relief. When he drifted off, it was into shallow, broken patches of unconsciousness, snapped apart by coughing fits and the panic of not finding enough air. He would jolt awake with the sensation that someone had placed a hand over his mouth, even though the room was empty except for tired attendants. Whispered prayers blended with the soft scrape of cloths wiping his face. The clink of bowls holding whatever he had just forced up from his lungs. Around the bed, faces changed. Early in his sickness, the chamber had been crowded with hopeful onlookers and bustling healers. Now, fewer people were allowed near him, and those who came stayed quieter, their eyes darting not to his crown or his signet ring, but to the way his chest rose and fell. Every visitor could see, even if they didn't say it aloud. This was not a passing illness. This was a body shutting down in stages, each symptom another door closing. From the corridors beyond, England still looked solid courts meeting, sermons preached, laws enforced. Inside that room, the truth was obvious. The kingdom's future was trapped in a young frame that could no longer control its own swelling, its own wounds, its own temperature. Edward had once been the carefully crafted symbol of a New England. Now, as his limbs puffed, his skin broke, and his strength drained away, he was becoming something else entirely. Living proof that even a crowned body can be reduced to failing tissue, and that an entire realm can depend on organs already slipping quietly toward collapse. By now, the people closest to Edward had begun to understand that something far worse than a stubborn infection was eating its way through him. It showed in the way they moved. Footsteps that once rang confidently down the corridors turned cautious near his door. Conversation snapped shut when his coughing started up again, as if every fit were a reminder that their time to use his name was almost over. Inside the chamber, the air felt thick, not just with the sour smell of sickness, but with fear sharp enough to taste. The king lay propped on pillows, but there was nothing regal left in the way his body arranged itself. His back curved as though an invisible weight were forcing him downward. Each breath sounded like it had to fight past something dense and unwelcome in his chest. When the coughing came, it was no longer a series of short bursts. It was a storm-long, dragging spasms that left him clawing for air, muscles straining in his neck, fingers clutching at the sheets. By the time the fit passed, his lips had taken on a faint bluish tinge, and sweat shone along his hairline like dew on a grave. The stuff he brought up no longer looked like anything the body should produce. Bowls beside the bed filled with thick, discolored mucus that clung to the sides like spoiled paint, yellow fading into green, streaked with black threads, shot through with a diluted rose that hinted at blood beneath. Attendants tried not to stare, but their faces betrayed them. They had seen wounds before, open gashes and battlefield injuries, yet this felt worse because it came from inside, from a place no bandage could reach. The physicians, once so certain and self-important, had been humbled into silence. They still performed their rituals, feeling for a pulse that faltered and raced, watching the way the skin changed color under their fingers, but their remedies had run out. The hot poultices, the purges, the bleeding, the potions with names longer than the king's remaining life, none of it changed the relentless tide rising in his lungs. When they spoke to the council, they wrapped their words in politeness, but the meaning was clear. Whatever was destroying him was beyond anything they knew how to halt. Edward understood more than anyone wanted to admit. He could feel his world shrinking, not just in the physical sense of being too weak to leave the bed, but in how far his voice traveled. Once, a word from him could send shockwaves through England. Laws altered, men condemned, churches stripped. Now, even in his own room, his commands barely reached the doorway. Short phrases exhausted him. Long sentences dissolved into coughing and labored breaths. He was a king whose authority now ended at the edge of his own body. Nights were the worst. The chamber dimmed, candles burned low, and all the grand illusions of power vanished with the daylight. What remained was a boy listening to his chest. The beats of his heart felt uneven, like a drum played by a tired hand. Breathing in required concentration. Breathing out took effort he didn't always have. Sometimes, in those long hours, he could sense it, the presence inside him, not a person or a spirit, but a process, tissue breaking down, fluid seeping into spaces meant for air, a slow drowning on dry land. Outside, documents still moved, seals still pressed into wax. Plan still turned around his fading signature. Inside, the truth was brutally simple. Whatever name doctors wanted to give it, consumption, a wasting disease, a rotting of the lungs, his own body had become the most hostile place he could inhabit. The country that had once seemed to sit safely beneath his feet was now far away, unreachable. Everything that mattered had narrowed to a single, terrible question. How long could a failing chest hold up the weight of an entire realm before both collapsed together? By midsummer, what was happening inside Edward's chest no longer felt like an illness. It felt like an occupation. His lungs, once invisible servants of the body, had become hostile territory to dark caverns filling with material that should never have left the shadows of an autopsy table. Every breath had to pass through those damaged spaces, scraping over raw tissue, picking up tainted moisture, then forcing it back out into the world in fits that shook the bed. When he coughed now, it sounded wrong even to untrained ears. The noise was thicker, almost bubbling, as if air were trying to claw its way through liquid. Each attack ended with that familiar, sickening ritual, the king leaning forward, attendants bracing him, a cloth or bowl pressed into his hands. What came out no longer resembled simple phlegm. It dragged itself from his throat in slow, ropey strands, clinging as if reluctant to leave. The colors had deepened into a grotesque spectrum: murky yellow, swamp green, streaks of soot black, and that soft wash of pink that whispered one cruel truth. Somewhere inside those collapsing lungs, blood was leaking into places it did not belong. The sensation of it was its own kind of torment. He could feel the stuff moving before it surfaced, sloshing when he shifted, rising when he tried to draw a deeper breath, sometimes simply lying still. He had the impression that part of his chest was heavier than the rest, like a waterlogged sponge pressed against bone. When a coughing fit finally forced the weight upward, it brought a momentous relief followed almost immediately by the dread of knowing more of the same remained below, waiting. Breathing ceased to be automatic. Every inhale required calculation. How far could he draw air without provoking another storm? How long could he hold it before the urge to cough became unbearable? The line narrowed day by day, until there was almost no safe space left between suffocating and triggering agony. Sleep, when it came, was shallow and fragile. He would drift for a few minutes, only to jolt awake with the sensation that his lungs had forgotten their task and were about to stop altogether. Inside his ribcage, the real catastrophe was invisible. In a healthy body, lungs are soft, springy, full of delicate branches that trade air for life. In Edward, those branches had become sites of rot. Pockets of infection had eaten through tissue, turning spongy pink into foul, collapsing cavities. Each time, he forced out another mouthful of corrupted fluid. He was, without realizing it, clearing the overflow from those internal wounds, emptying abscesses that would quickly fill again with pus, blood, and the debris of his own disintegrating flesh. The rest of his body reacted to this internal slaughter. His heart hammered desperately, trying to push enough oxygen pour blood through vessels that no longer carried real strength. His brain worked in bursts, clear 1 hour, fog the next, like a candle guttering whenever the room's air grew thin. His kidneys and other organs, starved and poisoned by the septic tide spreading from the lungs, began to falter in turn. The swelling in his limbs, the ulcers, the failing pulse, these were not separate complaints. They were signatures of the same process. His chest had become the original wound, and everything else was being dragged down with it. To those attending him, it must have seemed as if the king were gradually drowning in his own secret sea. No wave crashed, no river rose, yet his breath shortened, his voice thinned, and his world shrank to the distance between one cough and the next. On the walls, tapestry still showed heroic hunts and victorious battles. In the bed beneath them, the last Tudor boy king was locked in a much smaller, far more intimate war, a losing fight against the mutilated organs that had once sustained him, and were now methodically, relentlessly tearing him apart from within. By the end, Edward's body had become a kind of warning. This is what happens when a kingdom builds its future on a single pair of failing lungs. The council still clung to rituals, papers to sign, oaths to rehearse. A device to secure, but inside the bedchamber everyone could feel that the true clock was not on the wall, but in the young king's chest. Each breath was thinner than the last, each pause between coughs a little too long, as if the machinery inside him were considering stopping altogether. The chamber itself had changed character. Once a place of ceremony and careful etiquette, it now felt more like a sick room on the edge of a battlefield. Candles burned at all hours, not to impress visitors, but to chase away the stale, humid air. The windows, when open, let in drafts that made him shiver uncontrollably. When closed, they trapped the reek of sweat, medicine, and the metallic tang of what he kept spitting up. Even the tapestries seemed to sag, their woven haunts and victories mocking the fact that the only struggle left here was against suffocation in that claustrophobic space. The distance between politics and flesh disappeared. Men who had once sparked orders and argued doctrine now found themselves holding basins, steadying pillows, murmuring to keep the king calm between attacks. The same councillors who had used his name to order executions and crush uprisings were reduced to watching his chest, counting the rises and falls, silently begging for just a few more days. They needed him alive long enough for seals to be stamped, letters dispatched, soldiers positioned. He needed them for everything else. To turn him, wipe his face, lift a cup to his cracked lips. Edward, trapped at the center, lived into realities at once. On one level, he still thought like a ruler. He worried about the succession, about the survival of the Protestant changes made in his name, about the enemies who would celebrate the moment his heart stopped. On another, far more immediate level, all that grandeur shrank down to simple, animal questions. Could he draw the next breath without triggering agony? Would the next cough strip his throat raw? Could he endure another night of feeling his lungs gurgle and burn? The more his body failed, the more the illusion of royal invincibility peeled away. This was not a majestic, peaceful fading. It was a slow unmaking. Limbs puffed and useless, skin broken and discolored, fingernails loosening, hair coming away on the pillow, and, above all, that constant, grinding sound of air being dragged through ruined passages in his chest. The people who had once assured him that he was chosen, protected by God, now had nothing left to offer but laudanum and half-comforting words about heaven. Yet even as his organs collapsed, the weight of England did not lift from him. If anything, it pressed harder. Every time he woke from a fever doze, someone was waiting with a fresh decision that could not be delayed, with another signature that would shape the world after he was gone. His body was giving out, but his role as king refused to die with it. He was forced to keep performing sovereignty in a body that could barely perform breathing. That is where the real horror of this moment lies, not just in the pus-filled lungs and rotting tissue, but in the way a teenager, scarcely past childhood, was made to carry the terror of an entire realm while he himself was being destroyed cell by cell. England's experiment in building a new future on a boy's shoulders ended not with a clean break, but with a drawn-out collapse a young king pinned to his mattress, lungs turning to poison, still expected to decide how the story should continue after his own voice finally fell silent. By late June, time around Edward began to feel warped, as if the days themselves were rotting alongside his body. Morning and night bled into each other in a cycle of fever and exhaustion, each waking moment stitched together by the same rasping soundtrack, the labored drag of air, the wet rattle in his chest, the dull splash of another bowl being carried away. Outside, the calendar marched forward toward July. Inside, the only clock that mattered was the slowing rhythm of his lungs. His world had shrunk to the dimensions of the bed and the few faces that hovered constantly at its edge. Gentlemen of the bedchamber, once charged with dressing a king for ceremony, now spent their hours lifting a wasted teenager just enough to change his linens, turning him so new sores wouldn't tunnel to deep, wetting his lips when he no longer had the strength to raise a cup. They whispered reassurances they didn't believe, careful to keep their voices calm even when his eyes rolled back and his breathing paused longer than it should. Every small task carried an unspoken question. Was this the last time? Edward's own sense of himself flickered. Some days when opiates blurred the edges of his pain and the fever burned bright, he spoke like the ruler he had been trained to be, asking about letters, about the state of the realm, about whether his device had been set beyond challenge. On other days, all that training fell away, stripped by weakness until there was only a frightened boy, clutching at sheets, muttering short prayers he had known since childhood. The Latin phrases he'd once recited with perfect composure now slipped out broken and hoarse, punctuated by choked attempts to clear his throat. Sleep turned into a series of descents and jolts. He would drift into a heavy, suffocating darkness, feel himself sinking, then suddenly jolt awake with a wild gasp, convinced he'd stopped breathing altogether. In those moments, the grandeur of kingship meant nothing. There was only panic, the raw animal terror of a body convinced it is about to die. His hands would fly to his chest as if he could pry it open and scoop out the weight pressing down from within. Attendants would murmur, steadying him, waiting for the storm to pass before easing him back against the pillows. The sacred and the physical began to mix in unsettling ways. Clergy came and went, offering formal prayers, readings, and finally, confession. Words of sin and forgiveness floated through a room that stank of infection and failing organs. When they spoke of the soul leaving the body, it was no longer an abstract idea. Everyone present could imagine the moment as something audible, a final rattling exhale, the last gush of corrupt fluid, the silence that would follow. Edward had grown up believing that death could be glorious for the righteous. Now, stripped of his breath, he learned it could also be slow, messy, and humiliating. At the same time, he knew his ending was not his alone. Every flare of fever, every shallow gasp, shifted the balance of the realm beyond those walls. Allies and enemies alike were listening for news. Had his lungs held another night? Had his pulse faded? In that cramped, oppressive chamber, a teenager lay pinned beneath blankets, trapped in a body that was actively destroying itself. Beyond the door, a country waited not just for the death of a king, but for the moment his failing chest would finally surrender, and with it release all the chaos that had been building while he slowly drowned on dry land. By the last days, even hope had started to whisper instead of shout. The doctors had already told the council, in their careful way, that no remedy in their books could untangle what was happening inside Edward's chest. Yet they still clung to one habit. They watched for patterns. A small rally, a slight dip, any sign that the king might stagger on just long enough for their plans to harden into reality. In those final stretches, the pattern became cruelly clear, short flashes of clarity followed by longer descents into weakness. Like a candle flaring before it gutters. Edward's mind did something similar. There were moments when the fog lifted and he understood exactly where he stood. Not just on the edge of death, but at the point where his own body was about to trigger everything that had been set in motion in his name. He knew Mary was waiting, that Jane had been named, that his device was supposed to hold back a tide of Catholic revenge. Lying there, lungs gurgling and burning, he had to face the bitter truth that all the sermons and statutes he'd signed might still be washed away the instant his breathing stopped. For a boy raised to believe, history could be bent by doctrine and will. The realization that his ruined organs might undo him faster than any enemy must have landed. Like a final, private judgment. Around his bed, the choreography of power and piety blurred. Councillors knelt beside clergymen, each group laying claim to a different piece of what remained. One pressed for last signatures, last confirmations, a shaky nod here, a squeezed hand there. Anything that could later be called consent. The other urged him to look past the earthly struggle entirely. Confess, repent. Fix your eyes on heaven, not on London streets or your sister's quarrels. Edward was caught between them, torn by ragged breaths, trying to divide his dwindling strength between saving his soul and saving his version of England. His sickness had reached the point where the body no longer responded like a whole. Fingers twitched without purpose. Eyes slid past familiar faces as though they were already fading into memory. Sometimes he spoke to people who weren't their long-dead relatives, half-remembered tutors. Perhaps even the terrifying father whose approval he'd never truly earned. Fever dreams crawled into waking hours. The line between vision and reality thinned until he could almost believe that the world beyond the bed, the council chamber, the succession, the arguments about Jane and Mary, was just another hallucination, and the only real thing was the crushing weight in his chest. In quiet moments, when the opiates dulled his pain, but couldn't erase it, he must have wondered what would be left of him once the coughing stopped. Not the crown or the laws that was for others to tear apart or defend, but the story. Would he be remembered as a holy reformer? A pale monster in the making? A puppet? A victim? Or just as a boy who wasted away, choking on matter dredged from the ruins of his own lungs? The answer, of course, would be decided by the survivors. He was the one person in England who would never hear how they chose to tell it. Yet there is something almost poetic, in a grim way, about how his end mirrored his reign. So much of Edward's rule had been other people speaking through him, using his thin body as a channel for their beliefs and ambitions. In these final days, his body turned the pattern inward. The lungs that once fueled his voice became the instruments of his silence. The child who had been trained to carry a kingdom on careful shoulders was reduced to carrying one final weight, the knowledge that, when his failing chest finally gave up, the England he had tried to shape might exhale him out of its story just as ruthlessly as his own body had rejected air. In the end, the room felt more like a tomb that hadn't quite admitted it was one yet. Night pressed against the windows, candles burned low, and every sound seemed loud. The crackle of a wick, the rustle of linen, the soft, wet click of Edward's breathing. He lay almost weightless on the mattress, a bundle of bones and swelling, but the air around him was heavy. It carried the sense that something enormous, something larger than the boy in the bed, was about to break. His body was nearly finished. The swelling in his legs had crept upward, tightening his skin until it looked ready to split. Ulcers marked his limbs and back like dark stars, some scabbed over, others weeping through hastily changed bandages. His hair, once smooth and perfumed for court, clung in thin, damp strands to his skull. Nails had lifted from their beds, fingertips looked raw and tender. Yet the real violence was still happening behind his ribs. Every breath rattled, catching on the wreckage inside his chest. Sometimes he would open his mouth and nothing came, no air, no sound, only a long, terrifying pause before his lungs remembered their ruined duty and dragged in another thin thread of oxygen. Around him, the last witnesses hovered at the edge of his vision. A groom he trusted, a few loyal gentlemen, a cleric murmuring half-heard prayers. No roaring crowd, no triumphal speeches, just tired men watching a boy fight an enemy they could not reach. Their faces had lost all courtly polish, eyes red-rimmed, lips pressed tight whenever his chest stuttered. These were not the expressions of people watching a king pass gently. They were the looks of men forced to witness a slow suffocation they were powerless to stop. Edward drifted in and out of clarity. At one moment, he could form a short, precise request, a cup to wet his cracked mouth, a repositioning of a limb that had gone numb, a brief assurance that certain papers were in order. The next, he slipped into half-dreams, speaking to absences, reaching for things that weren't in the room. In those clearer flashes, he understood what was happening. He could feel his body no longer obeyed him, that each cough stripped away strength he would never regain. He knew, too, that beyond the stifling chamber, people were already acting as if he were gone. The nights collapsed into one another. Fever flared, broke, then flared again. Opiates dulled his pain, but couldn't erase it. They only smeared the edges, turning sharp terror into a heavy, dragging dread. Sometimes he would lie still, eyes half open, listening to the liquid shift in his lungs with each small movement. The sensation was obscene, like carrying a grave inside his own chest. When the coffin came, it dragged up more foul-smelling matter, leaving him gasping, throat burning, vision speckled with black. By the last evening, the fight had narrowed to a single, brutal task: keep breathing. No more plans, no more reforms, no more arguments about succession. Just that endless, grinding effort to pull air through destroyed passages, hold it for a heartbeat, then push it back out past ruined tissue and clotted remnants of what his lungs had been. His world shrank to the space between one breath and the next, and then, at some point between those flickering moments of consciousness and the dark beyond them, the disease machinery inside him finally refused to move. The hidden ulcers, the flooded airways, the poisoned blood, all of it reached the quiet, inevitable conclusion it had been moving toward for months. The boy who had once been presented as England's miracle heir, the instrument of a new faith, died not in a burst of glory, but in the small, suffocating silence that follows a final failed attempt to draw an heir. Outside the bed, arguments and armies would soon raise to fill the gap he left behind. But in that room, at that moment, what ended was simpler and far more horrifying. A 15-year-old chest torn apart from the inside, finally broken to rise again. When Edward died, his story should have ended with the closing of his eyes. It didn't. In some ways, the most disturbing chapter began only after his chest finally fell still. The attendants who had watched him choke and fade now had to turn the body of a boy into the relic of a king. They washed what they could, limbs puffy with trapped fluid, skin marked by sores and strange discolorations, fingers where gangrene had begun to darken the tips. Every touch reminded them that this was not a peaceful passing, but the aftermath of months of internal decay. The rituals moved forward anyway. Fine cloths were wrapped around a frame that no longer resembled the idealized portraits painted just a few years earlier. Perfumes and herbs were packed in thickly, not out of reverence alone, but to fight the sour, metallic odor that clung to his remains. Layers of rich fabric and carved wood tried to hide what the disease had done, but they couldn't erase the knowledge of it for those who had stood by his bed. To them, every fold of velvet and every gleaming ornament on the coffin was like a lid slammed shut on the memory of a boy gasping for air. While the body was sealed and prepared, the world outside the chamber erupted. The breath had barely left his lungs before messengers were writing hard proclamations, drafted oaths demanded. The fragile device he had been forced to endure shuddered into life. Jane Grey was named queen. Prayers were altered, crowds ordered to accept a new sovereign they had never expected. All of it, every hurried move and desperate claim, was powered by the emptiness he left behind. His rotted lungs had become a political vacuum, sucking the country toward confrontation. For 9 days, England tried to pretend it had followed the dead boy's last wishes. Banners were raised for Jane, coins struck in her name. Courtiers reshuffled themselves around a different teenager's shadow. But beyond London and the tight circles of power, another force gathered. Mary, the sister Edward had tried to cut out of the future, raised her own banner. Where his lungs had lost every battle, her cause gained strength with each new supporter. The fight that his diseased body had postponed for as long as it could now burst fully into the open. In that struggle, Edward himself became strangely distant. His corpse lay entombed in stone and ceremony while living people tore at the meaning of his short reign. Was he a saint of the true religion? A cold instrument of cruelty? A pawn? A warning? Different mouths use his memory like his counselors had once used his signature. As a tool, Mary would hold Catholic rites for his soul even as she dismantled his reforms. Protestants would later claim him as a martyr king, conveniently tidying away the uglier parts of his policies and his death. That is the final horror of Edward's story. A boy's body was first consumed from within by unseen ulcers. Then, once it failed, his image was consumed by others, rewritten, argued over, polished, or blackened to suit whatever came next. In life, he had coughed up the physical evidence of his own destruction. In death, the realm he left behind continued to spit out new versions of him, Hero, monster, victim, symbol. The lungs that once tried and failed to keep him alive had stopped moving. But the darkness that gathered around the way he lived and died kept breathing on, long after his own breath had gone.